As you can see, the Ball diff gearbox looks to be the most complicated part to do. There are so many parts in the bag when you unwrap it. There is a flow chart of all the components and the order that they go in to go together. What I would always suggest is that the bags, if you open them up, just find a container to put some of your small screws in so they don't go rolling off. It also does come with the majority of the bearings, so all you really need are the 4 bearings for the front wheels, if you're putting the bearings set in. And you will need to remove the spur gear off the old diff, as there isn't a spur gear supplied with it. So it's worth just saying, you know, if you don't want to invest in a Ball diff, you can actually change the character of the diff and how much it slips, really by just undoing these 3 screws and then using various diff greases inside, and that'll just change, you know, help change the characters. You might want to try that first before, you know, going the whole hog and doing the Ball diff, but you will need some diff grease, you know, to obviously assemble it. You can see I've got all the parts laid out for the pod. First part to join up is the motor plate to the back. You'll find there's a small pin that'll help you get the orientation correct. Once that piece is in place, I'd advise just mounting the motor, remembering that the black wire should go down as it's fractionally longer. And just enough to hold the motor, but not really tight because we'll need it loose to set the gear mesh a little bit later. Now you want to pop on this bottom part. Again, there's some pins to locate it. This stage, just pop 1 screw in, it'll just hold it in place. Top piece, there's some little pins, they drop into the side. You want to just make sure that the wires for the motor are both coming up through the little hole. And when they are, this end plate will go on. And then you can just pop couple of screws in to hold it, and then finally go through, add all the other remaining screws and the 3 that go in the bottom, and then we're ready to start assembling the Ball diff. So I'll go ahead and do that and then come back to start assembly. I've laid out all the parts that we'll need to put the Ball diff together. There's a couple of sort of sub-assemblies that you can do just to make the final assembly that much easier. You need to remove this spur gear from the old gear diff. So if you remove the 3 screws that are on there, you'll see there's 1 left. You'll then be left with the spur gear attached to a plate. That plate, if you just push, will come away and you'll be left just with that spur gear. That now needs to be mounted on this black plastic part, and again that will just clip into place, and then the 3 screws go in there. I've already installed in these 2 aluminium collars the small grub screws ready for mounting. This final aluminium piece, there are 2 bearings. The larger goes in the back and the smaller one goes in the front. And also on this black plastic section, the final bearing fits into the back of there. And what you'll need to do is, you'll see the 6 small holes. Just apply a bit of diff grease into each of those holes. This will ensure that the balls are well greased, and also that there is grease for the 2 washers. In the instructions it does say about greasing these 2 washers. I've always found that if I just put enough grease in there, that's adequate, because what you'll find is that the grease will actually attract some dust and dirt, so you want to try and keep it to a minimum. Put those balls in, just drop them in one at a time, and you'll see that they'll just go into the holes where the grease has been. I'll go ahead and put the last of the balls in and screw the spur gear down and come back for assembly. To mount the aluminium collars, I'm going to start with this one, and you're just looking for this flat spot on the shaft, and that's where the grub screw is going to mount down onto. So you just need to line up those 2 parts, drop that on, and then just tighten up the grub screw. Handy tip, if you just get a small piece of paper, and punch a standard hole punch through. This is going to help us set the distance of these two parts, because it's very easy to tighten these two up and they'll bind. So we just pop that piece of paper over there, pop your last collar on, pinch the two together as you tighten down the grub screw. And then you can just remove the piece of paper and you'll find there'll be very little play in, but the shaft won't be binding. Okay, let's pop that on our stand. You'll notice that we've not put the old cover back on, and that's really because the top plate won't fit with the ball diff. Now we just install first washer. If you look, you'll see there's a flat side. That'll make with a flat side on that aluminium plate. Now we need to drop down the motor pinion, and then the spur, on the back of this aluminium part you need to put the other washer on, and again lining up the flat sections. Drop that down, put that final bearing in. We now want to set the gear mesh between the pinion and the spur gear, but to do this we'll need to mount up the wheels, as that's what keeps the tension inside the diff, and that'll stop it, any play in here. So what we need to do is one wheel goes on the bottom, and this top wheel now is very different. Mount the wheel up as you would normally. There's then a bearing that drops in the top, and then there's a small cone washer, and just check on the diagram, the rounded part goes facing down, and you may just need to line those up. Lined up. Just pop one of the wheel nuts in, tighten that down, and then you'll need to hold both wheels to get some tension on. Then you'll feel that play is then taken out of that spur. Okay. You'll note that when we mounted up the pinion, we've actually mounted it upside down to as it would be as standard, and that's because this spur gear is sat now much higher than it was before. The setup's the same. What we need to do is just make sure that the pinion gear is level with the top of the motor. If you've got a standard motor, make sure the grub screw is going to mount up on the shaft. And then what we're going to do is pop a piece of ordinary paper through, wind that through. Find that it's too tight and you need to slacken off the motor screws, do. Otherwise, when you're happy, tighten up the pinion. Check the mesh. And when you're happy with that, just tighten up the screws on the motor. They shouldn't be too tight, but also not so loose that the gears will strip. Once that's achieved, put the other wheel back on, and this side just has a plastic bushing. No bearing on this. And tighten that one down. Now to adjust the slip, what you need to do is slacken off this wheel nut to make it slip more. We'll tighten it up so that it slips less. The beauty is you can very easily adjust this when you're driving or for different setups and when you're racing, just by tightening or loosening that side. Okay, we're now ready to mount the pod back on the chassis. What we need to look for in the bottom of the chassis are the two holes. If you look here on this particular kit, they're at the back. where the pod was mounted. Line that up. And as before, little back turn, drop in and then tighten those up. Check at this point that your two motor wires are actually coming through to the front. And we then just need to mount up the rear shock. If you make the pod hang off the back of your work stand, you'll find this much easier. I'll just zoom in to show you closer. This spacer needs to drop down that section, and you'll see there's a recess that it'll sit in like that. Then you want to just lift that pod up so that the loop of the shock goes on. And remember that this screw had a O-ring on. It goes in the front. Again, you can now slide that on the stand. Tighten that down, and remember to tighten down the front screw also. Just check that that pod runs free. Now we need to connect up the motor wires that are here. At this point, make sure you get your colours the right way around, so obviously black to black, and they should push in so there's no metal showing after the connectors. For the front wheels, similar to the back, take off the wheel nut. Remove the wheel. In the wheel you'll see there is one bearing in the back. There's actually then one bearing in the front. So like we did on the back, if you just use a small screwdriver, you should be able to push both those bearings out. And you can actually see that on this surface that they've already started to wear. Then what you need to do is with the new bearings, pop them in. Just check that they seat home. One in the front and one in the back. Put those back on the shaft. Pop your nut in your tool. And then wind them home till they're just tight. You find if you over tighten them, there'll be resistance. They just want to be bitten on to the bearings. And you can see how much smoother that runs than the standard wheel. And we can now then mount our body back up. So just the body will then drop down on the mountings, and then we can just put the clips back, push them in through the holes in the body posts. And then we're ready to go outside for testing. I hope this helps anybody with the upgrades. If you've got any questions, comments or anything, and please do rate the video. Thanks for watching.